Okay. Well, it's 10:30, so I'll go ahead and start. So, welcome everyone to PopCon 2020, the first virtual version of the Pop Conference. And I just want to thank the program committee and Karen Tongson and everyone and all the folks at MoPop, Robert, for making sure we're online and broadcasting. My name is Michelle Habell-Pallán, and I'm signing in from the unceded lands of the Duwamish Coast Salish people on which the University of Washington in Seattle sits. And I am so thrilled to introduce and moderate this panel, which is titled Todas means all, the past, present, and future of Todas Las Edades, all ages, spaces, and Latinx communities. And now I'm going to introduce my colleagues who are a part of this panel, who are compose this panel. They are Dr. Jorge N. Leal, who is an assistant professor in the Department of History at UC Riverside. And congratulations, he's beginning his first year in this wonderful year, academic year. And then we have Susana Sepulveda, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Arizona in the Department of Gender and Women's Studies. And last but not least is Audrey Silvestre, who is a doctoral candidate at the Cesar E. Chavez Department of Chicano and Central American Studies at UCLA. I just want to quickly note that your panelists have posted questions for you, the audience, to review during the panel to prepare for the conversation that will come at the end. Now, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Professor Leal. Thank you, everyone.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks everyone for joining us. And also for the organizers that make this possible. I think that if we didn't have this technology, I would have had to send you my paper, right, by email. So I'm glad that we were able to have create this community in DIY ways and be able to share conversation even at the moment of all these cascading crises. So today I want to just share some rather brief and informal descriptions as opposed to a more prepare a statement, particularly because I have been thinking about what collective spaces that are created by music participants. In my case, US-born Latinx youth or immigrant youth in the 1990s and 2000s, but also what does that mean for not only for the present and the possible futures, especially at this current moment where we live in between this colliding set of crises that has definitely made me rethink and question how to think of all each spaces at this moment. So I'll tell you a little bit about the past, and then speculate about what the possible futures could be for this collective and oppositional spaces at this socially distant and fraught period. And lastly, as you see, we do have some questions, and please feel free to chime in at any point, and we'll engage in conversation with you all about this. So Audrey, next slide, please. So in my work, I examine youth and musical cultures around rock Latinoamericano, rock en español, and associated music genres such as punk, ska, that were and are embraced by Latin American immigrants and US Latinx youth. So after a long day of work and being ostracized, mistreated, or at best ignoring the city, these DIY all age spaces have long been the host for Latinx youth who yearn to come together to dance to syncopated ska and punk beats, and in doing so, assert their belonging in Southern California. However, prominent music venues located in Hollywood have long excluded musicians and audiences of color. So going to Hollywood or to formal music venues has not been a possibility due to this social segregation of the city all the way through the beginning of the 21st century and even now. So where do people, these rockeras, rockeros, punk rockers, skankers, meet in the late night? Here's where the ingenuity and enterprising came in, as they created their own improvised venues in what I define as ephemeral forms. These were improvised spaces that took places in mostly Latinx neighborhoods. They could be backyards. In Southern California, we have these backyards in our homes or in apartment buildings, warehouses, mechanic auto shops, and whichever other space that could be used in the absence of formal music venues. To get there, And these are two images that we see from this type of venues. So it is in the city of Southgate in 1995. And together, the event producers created these hand-drawn flyers. The creators of these flyers were either immigrants or second-generation Latinx. And if you see the flyer in the middle, there were these maps that were hand-drawn that mapped the location, but also for me, this is a way of spatializing and placing their belonging in the metropolitan Los Angeles, both sonically and cartographically. So through these ephemeral forms, Latinx made spatial claims of belonging in the metropolis and continued the cultural exchange and political advocacy in the 1990s, a time of explosive anti-immigrant sentiment as the passage of Prop 187 in 1994 and several key pieces of federal legislation that further criminalized immigrants. A key characteristic of these ephemeral forums is the emphasis for these events to be open to all ages attendees. This is not only about age, but also immigrant status. In all ages events did not require attendees to present a state issue identification. So foregoing this requisite also allow for the attendance and inclusion of people whose uncertain or unauthorized migration status bar them from processing U.S. government identifications. But most importantly, it allowed for those possibilities of inclusion of belonging for people of irrespective legal status, even when other activities and locations were off limits to them due to their inability to have this documentation. So being together in these spaces, as precarious and ephemeral they were, Latinx youth were there with their clenched teeth, yes, but also jubilant that they had found each other in the middle or the periphery of the metropolis. They heard music, dance pogo, mosh, or by pushing against each other. Next slide, please. And yes, some of them were there for the music, to let off steam after a long, hard day of labor and being marginalized in the city. But others became politicized in these gigs, as the bands commonly touch on the issues of racism, police brutality, and immigrant bashing in their songs. And you can see the discourse that was created around these spaces. On the left, you can see the all ages, which is like this marker of everyone, it's welcome, at least in terms of migratory status, and not only age. And in the other one, we see this backyard punk gig in South LA, and how it discusses police brutality and fascism and this is in the 2000s, in 2000 actually. So you did get politicized during this moment. They went on to be organizers and participants in many protests, against police brutality, against anti-immigrant legislation, and next slide, please. And also part of the 2006 immigration reform marches, which at the time they were the biggest civil rights manifestations in the history of the U.S. that have now been superseded by these summer-long uprising marches and protests in the U.S. So now, these ephemeral forums in Latinx Los Angeles are part of this long genealogy of the do-it-yourself ethos of marginalized music scenes in the U.S., and also the legacies of the Hoyos Funkies, which are improvised music venues in the working class periphery of Mexico City. The backyard gig, the unorthodox storefront, or as a venue has then a long tradition that is rooted in its own social, racial, gender context. Yet, as a historian, I'm interested in learning how people in the past have created and imagined what was impossible to make it possible. Thus, I study the past really because I'm interested in the future and how we can create futures that seem quite impossible now, but based on this expansive imagination of the past, make them possible in the present and the future. And this next slide, please, Audrey. This brings me to what we can think of our present and this cascade of crises that we're facing. A health crisis that is part and parcel of systemic racism and police brutality, and the environmental crisis, which all of these affect Latinx and people of color in disproportionate numbers. I mean, it is great that we have this current technology, but let's be honest, Zoom simply cannot and will not be a substitute for the live concert experience, for a night at the backyard gig, and for community building identity making, and the political possibilities of community creation. So for participants of ephemeral forums, be it organizers, performers, audience members, or any music fan, this, let's be honest, this is an awful moment. No one signed up to play at a concert on Zoom or to check out a concert on Zoom and mosh in your bedroom. But for our health, we're staying away from being indoors in crowded spaces or being community. This also precludes the gathering, organizing, and creating communities in the ways we have done so now. Yet, this unimaginable pandemic ambitious present, we also see glimmers of that radical imagination arising from community making and activism. For example, in the June Los Angeles protests as part of the global rising against systemic racism and police brutality, sparked by the killing of George Floyd, the members of Vandalize, a punk band from the predominantly Latinx city of Pico Rivera, and Latinx themselves, got on a truck bed with a drum set, some amps, a guitar, and a generator, and joined in to provide a hardcore punk sound out to the protest, making their truck a portable ephemeral forum, I would say, but also making community, even at distance, with protesters on their cars. On the other hand, we do see bands coming together, albeit virtually, to perform and be part of benefit and advocacy shows that highlight and center Black, Indigenous, and people of color in punk and ska scenes. Most significant, these two examples let us begin expanding what is possible in terms of live music on protest during this time. I do say a time rather than a period, than a moment, because we're uncertain how long this would last and how this will transform our collective and music spaces in the future. What does it mean to be all ages when everything is all ages in some ways in this virtual moment? So in order to, next slide, Audrey, please. So in order to at least begin preparing for us to imagine these futures, I invite you to use your most expansive imagination to consider the following question. How can we reimagine and create intergenerational spaces, scenes during these types of multiple crises? So I look forward to reading your thoughts in the chat and in our conversation later on. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Jorge. That was exactly 10 minutes. Thank you. And we'll come back and talk. Please hold your questions for now, or please put them in the chat, and we'll come back to them. And right now, I'd like to hand it off to Susana, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. To give some, I'm currently working on a paper about all ages music venues as impactful sites of identity formations, as fostering communities and enabling youth cultures to flourish. And my focus is on The Smell, the infamous nonprofit, volunteer-run, all ages and do-it-yourself or DIY music venue located in the heart of downtown Los Angeles, which has been operating since 1998 as the only all ages venue in downtown LA, and is one of the last remaining within the broader LA area. And as the previous discussion or asynchronous discussion kind of also mentioned, it's kind of like, like there are very few spaces that kind of exist like this now, and especially like are in such more of a grave, precarious situation given COVID, and they're already kind of like difficulties in self-sustaining at times. So I highlight the ways in which the venue promotes community engagement, accessibility to art and music, while also being sustained by intergenerational participants and our participation. Audrey, next slide, please. So one of the things that emerged for me as I was writing this was the realization that in my broader work on Chicana punk subcultures, I don't really use the term youth culture. And this is perhaps because I do not approach punk necessarily or strictly as youth culture or as a youth subculture. Rather, I perceive it as an intergenerational cultural movement where participants of all ages recreate and transform it in their everyday lives, activities, cultural productions, or whatever. And it is important to note that punk has been consistently transformed by each subsequent generation, perhaps being the key aspect of its longevity. And this is something that I also notice as being part of the culture fostered at The Smell and more broadly within DIY all ages spaces. These are, these are elements that I also see are kind of blanketed or dismissed, or there's a tendency for these elements to kind of be dismissed when the term youth culture is kind of used at times in terms of like what perceptions of youth culture can kind of emerge. And so this is also similarly in terms of like the dominant representations of punk, where ideas of youth culture are in a way already defaulted as white, heterosexual, and masculine. So I am further interested in how people of color, specifically Chicanas and Latinas, experience youth culture. And this inquiry circles back to my questions about the smell as a site that sustains DIY all ages practices while challenging presumptions about youth culture, most notably that it's by and for young people, and the idea that all ages means kids. I see it as fostering youth culture in a broader sense. I also think about how Latinas and Chicanas experience youth culture often as something that needs to be refashioned for it to speak to their experiences and for folks to feel like participants. And so put another way, I see it more as how participation in youth culture is refashioned to be more expansive and diverse for Chicanas and Latinas. Thus, there is something to say about how women of color hold spaces in places like the smell that might not always be understood under the umbrella of youth culture. Next slide, please. So to provide some background on my own experiences with the smell, so in the PowerPoint, like the questions raised, these are some of the questions that are raised, just reiterating, but I grew up in northern LA in Tujunga, which is a little remote. It feels like a small town within a big city. And, you know, I was, you know, a first generation immigrant Latina growing up as a self-defined punk and riot girl, the black sheep of my family. And the smell was one of the only music venues accessible to me at my age. I was 15. It was cheap. It's always been $5 entrance fee, and its locality was generally accessible to me. The first time I went to see the smell was in 2005, and it was to go see Mika Miko, one of the first all-woman punk bands that I saw perform, and whom at the time I considered a riot girl band, even though, you know, like there's just debates about, you know, genre and, you know, we're not a riot girl. But I was completely blown away to see a group of women, including a Latina guitarist, take over the stage and rile up a dense crowd. Next slide, please. And so I felt that I had found a space that would help me evolve as an aspiring artist and musician, and where I could find a sense of community. And while the smell did come off as predominantly, like a predominantly white space at the time, there were inklings of greater diversity, even if I had not known that at the time. A few years later, I became a volunteer, and this allowed me to learn how to organize events via punk DIY ethos. And in 2008, I began to organize the Riot Girl Carnival, an annual punk and Riot Girl inspired music festival that centers women, queer, and non-gender conforming artists of color and of all ages. And my vision was really to see it spread, to move around like a carnival, like Lady Fest, the Feminist Global Music Festival, but instead it became a locus at the smell for riot girls and punks of color, and particularly of Latino backgrounds. Next slide, please. And so this is just a flyer of the 2016 Riot Girl Carnival fundraiser for Chicas Rockeras. So organizing the Riot Girl Carnival throughout the years was a way for me to foster a scene and sense of belonging at the smell, and where I could invite bands and friends that I wanted to see and share space with that I might not otherwise have access to. And the smell became a site where this became possible. And I see it as a site of fluidity and possibility that is shaped by DIY and all ages practices that allows for events like the Riot Girl Carnival to hold space for queer, non-binary, and women of color, even if it's just for that one night a year. But in just concluding thoughts, what I hope this work to kind of engage is an understanding of conceptions of how youth cultures are challenged and further complicated by the experiences and participation of Chicanas and Latinas within DIY all ages music venues. I use a narrative approach where I reflect on my own experiences and observations at the smell, And I argue that spaces like this provide a way for women of color to refashion alternative spaces in ways that become more inclusive of difference. And I see the smell, again, as a site for this possibility. And even though, again, that it may be perceived as fitting the mold of male punk space, you know, I see it as open to change, where as a volunteer run space and intergenerational, it really lets attendees, performers, and volunteers take the lead in what they would like to see and experience in these spaces. So thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Susana. I have so many questions and comments, but I'm going to hold them until after we get to hear from Audrey. So Audrey, I'm going to hand it over to you. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to just start. So on a hot Saturday afternoon in 2017, Chicas Rockeras Southeast Los Angeles packed into the Glennon Club in Linwood, California to host their annual showcase. The Rock and Roll Roses, just tall enough to reach the microphone with instruments almost as big as them, bravely took center stage to debut their summer hit, Litterbugs Get No Hugs, with the following memorable lyrics. The world is beautiful, as you can see. Keep it clean for you and me. Litterbugs get no hugs. Litterbugs get no hugs. No tires basura. I began with the Rock and Roll Roses to consider a feminist and queer brown genealogy of all ages spaces that have contributed to the formation of Chicas Rockeras in Southeast Los Angeles, a summer rock camp for girls and gender expansive youth. So my goal is to briefly examine the complexities of youth culture and intergenerational spaces. Southeast LA is a predominantly working class and immigrant Latinx and Chicanx community that is underfunded, experiences environmental injustices, and only makes headlines because of city scandals. So, whoops, I'm forgetting. Okay, so in 2014, Chicas Rockeras Southeast Los Angeles was conspired by a group of punks that call themselves Las Comadres. So Las Comadres are Vicky, Noel, Tina, Myra, and Marin. They were all involved in the local punk scene by playing in bands, booking shows, working sound, and involved in other ways. So Marina and Myra were in Bruised Violet, Vicky and Noel were in Apostasis, and Tina was in the band Angustia. So through their bands, they all played and attended backyard shows in local venues such as Our House in Linwood, California, which we saw a little flyer, the Allen and the short-lived Cafe Cashmere in Southgate, and all of these venues are now closed. So although these all ages spaces were formative to Las Comadres, like many women, gender non-binary folks in the scene, they all simultaneously experience both invisibility and hypervisibility by being tokenized, sexualized, and ignored. So Tina remembers dudes offering unsolicited advice on how she should hold her mic. And as a teenager with her band Civil Amok, she recollects what she describes as quote unquote Budweiser dudes screaming, "Show us your boobs" in between songs. Tina also shares that with Angustia, which is made up of herself, Cindy, Anthony, and Chepe. After playing, guys would approach them to compliment them, but would only address Anthony and Chepe, ignoring both Tina and Cindy. So when given the opportunity to be involved in all women, queer and trans brown spaces, Las Comadres all jumped at the opportunity. So Marina and Myra were involved with Clip Fest and Lady Fest in 2009 and in 2013. Noel and Vicky also joined the organizing of Lady Fest in 2013. And Tina with her band, she played both festivals. So, and additionally, they all also volunteered at either the OC and the LA Rock Camp for girls, except for Tina. But, you know, participating in these spaces really inspired and kind of gave them the energy to continue and be inspired to then want to start the rock camp in Southeast LA. So Vicky and Noel had this idea and Marine did too. And so they eventually came together to, you know, meet. So racism and classism have been widely documented in the Riot Girl scene. I think it's important to note that Las Comadres were inspired by Riot Girl, but also reshaped it to fit their needs and those of their communities. So in doing so, I think they have expanded what Riot Girl is and who can claim it. So there are various experiences of racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia in different spaces, and also growing up in Southeast LA have informed the decision-making process for Las Comadres, from the name of the camp to the location, to tuition, and so many other details. So for example, Tina mentioned that her mom would have probably not been able to afford the $150 tuition that it costs to attend camp. So it was important that tuition be on a sliding scale. And it was important for them to remove as many possible barriers so that anybody who wanted to attend camp could. So as a result, Chicas Rockeras is an intergenerational space that developed from all ages spaces and was inspired by the riot girl scene, but it has not been easy to sustain. I argue that this difficulty is in part due to the lack of investment in Black and brown girls, gender expansive, and queer youth. So CRCL challenges notions of gender, race, age, class, and also like what counts as acceptable extracurricular activities. And because they do this, they face the difficulty of translating what I would argue is an intersectional feminist queer and punk approach to both the local and the wider community. So one example is navigating, quote unquote adults, such as parents or school administrators, which did ensue some doubts. So Myra shared, quote, at one point I was like, well, we look like a bunch of punks. So it's like, how are they gonna even trust us with their kids, end quote. So, difficulties emerge like that, but also difficulties emerge in securing physical space in Southeast LA and particularly for their showcase, which culminates the camp. So over the last 6 years of programming, Las Comadres have approached the city, the community centers to host the showcase, and have been met by being asked to pay like $20,000, or sometimes they're just ghosted or straight up denied. So Las Comadres have turned to private spaces such as quinceañera halls, which present their own set of challenges. So in as one example, one venue Las Comadres rented, they removed gender neutral bathroom signs that had been posted on the bathrooms, and they had private security searching through the bags of campers. And this was after a long conversation, with telling them that, they didn't want to have like police presence or security presence. And people have suggested to move the showcase outside of Southeast LA, but for Las Comadres, that's not an option because it circles back to, the idea of not having to leave one's neighborhood, but also keeping it geographically accessible to the community. But despite all these hurdles, CRCL again forms intergenerational relationships that are fostered, with both campers and volunteers, where they inspire each other. And so I forgot about my own slides. So in particular, I point out volunteers such as Alice Back, Frank, and Drew from the band Trap Girl, and they all offer a particular nuanced sense of futurity to both campers and volunteers that transgress the boundaries of punk, age, gender, and much more. So to close, Las Comadres, through a refusal to so-called quote unquote grow up, have taken matters into their own hands by creating and sustaining necessary spaces in Southeast LA for young brown girls, gender expansive youth, and the volunteers themselves. So all of this points to the possibilities to transform spaces and build intergenerational communities so that a band called Estropunk can scream into the microphone, "Here comes your favorite brown girl, present this brown girl. You can't put down this brown girl. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow, what an incredible set of papers. And I have a lot of questions, but first I'm going to open it up to the audience, please. Either in the chat box or please, I think you can unmute yourself at this point. Is that true? I'm not sure. Maybe somebody could try from the audience. Or maybe I think you have to, let's see.
Michelle, you'll be able to unmute folks. And for the attendees, if you would like to share a comment, the best way to do that is to perhaps raise your hand or just note in the chat field that you would like to share a comment. Either one of those will work.
Yes, because there are so many of you, I can't see you all on one screen, but I can see everything in the chat. While we're waiting, I can just say some few things off the top of my head. So what is so wonderful and inspiring here is to hear these stories across the intergenerational, even support, right, of creating these scenes. Like if and I'll start with Jorge, just because you're the historian, thinking about the backyard spaces where young people make, parties or have events. Well, those yards are often the backyards of parents. So whether the parents are listening to the music or not, they are also part of that intergenerational infrastructure that really has to exist, right? And so that leads me to think about how even in the 1960s on the East Side Sound, that I remember the moms, there's stories of the moms who would be driving the boys in the bands who would be doing the Battle of the Bands all, in LA, kind of Boyle Heights area, or even out when they had to go out maybe more towards Riverside or Pacoima. So this idea of this larger social infrastructure that's intergenerational, it has really sustained the scenes in East Los or even the greater LA metro area, since scenes began, in the 60s and probably even before. But that leads me to think about how Susana was really, I loved how you talked about how the idea of youth culture really masks over how, especially in a kind of practice like punk, where you have this continual recreation, and perhaps that's why why it has such a long life, or why its life is very vital, is because there is a thread, but it is continually reimagined. And I think, having those pictures of Frank and Alice Bagg in the middle of, with Audrey's presentation also points to that intergenerational, that's so, vital, or the way that we need to think about Latinx, Chicanx, Mexicanx in LA scenes is through that intergenerational framework. So, and that's not to say that there's agreement all the time among the generations, but sometimes there is just enough little support and understanding that fuels, something really, really major. I also wanted, I love Chicas Rockeras, which that is a camp where I met both Audrey and Susana, and that is an incredible space, and my daughter attends, and I want to kind of link it. You mentioned the Estropunks song, Brown Girl, and the lead singer of that song is Amaris Hunter, who I know from Seattle, from the Seattle Fandango Project. So Amaris I've known since she was 9 and was part of the community building project here that we do with Seattle Fandango Project. And to there's a big story of why she ends up in LA, but with her family. But to see her in that space, that so much reminded me of the intergenerational spirit we really were mentoring in Seattle Fandango Project, and also Women Who Rock, because Amaris was also a big part of Women Who Rock. So it's just fun to see how this practice is very specific to a location. At the same time, we take those practices wherever we go and we implement them, right? So up here in the unceded lands of the Duwamish territory, right, we enact a particular way of relationality. And I think what you're all talking about, if I could borrow from my Indigenous scholars friends, is to think about this practice of relationality that is really, however we talk about it as Chicanx, Latinx, Mexicanx folks, there is deeply embedded this really communal practice. And I'll end there. And hopefully more people can, let's see, okay, I have something from Eddie. Eddie, do you want to go ahead and let us hear from you? Let's see. Okay. It says ask to unmute. So let me see if I can Is that it? Okay, there you go.
Were you talking to me, Michelle? Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, Professor Eddie Alvarez, yes.
No, I couldn't hear well. No, I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed everyone's presentations. I've been on panels with some of y'all before, and it's nice to, to also be on the other side. Something that I noted in the chat was just one of the guiding questions was just memories of the scenes that shaped me, like Arena nightclub, but also the Rock en Español scene, also the Quebradita club scene, even though I wasn't as immersed in it, right? And then later I mentioned, to respond to Karen's comment, about like the cross-pollination, especially with like the youth, like everybody was kind of going everywhere. I don't know, at least that's what I saw in my experiences. I feel like those maps, right, Jorge, that you provided, there's so many layers of like the way that youth probably traversed the city into different scenes. Yes, maybe some folks kind of stuck more with one scene, but I feel like there's that cross-pollination. I don't know what you all think about that, but yeah, I just thank you so much. I feel honored that I was able to jump on in the middle in between grading. So thank you.
Thanks. And here is a chat message from Glenn. Glenn, I don't know if, let's see if I can see you. Glenn, if I can unmute you if you'd like to share. Let's see. Or Jorge, maybe you can, I can't see Glenn. Let's see. I'll go ahead and just read Glenn's comment. As a white Canadian queer guy in my 40s, the term navigating adults was such an interesting phrase and important reminder. Here in Ottawa, Canada, there is a Girls Rock Ottawa group as well, and community organizing through the BIPOC female identified community as well. But the financial gatekeepers and holders of resources still remain mostly white and straight male, unfortunately. I think, yeah, a response would be great because from the outside, it looks, there's a lot of internal fundraising for Chicas Rockeras, and it seems like you're not beholden. Like the vision is the vision that you create.
Yeah, I think I use that phrase, navigating adults, and it was in relation to, from talking to Las Comadres, who some of them are here, so if you want to speak up, go ahead. That they were talking about, like having to go talk to like the principal and maybe like toning down like a punk look, right? So it's those moments of like, right, navigating and yeah, like who has access to resources that people need. So, and the picture actually I shared of Las Comadres is outside of Olin, which is the school where the camp is hosted. And, so that those outfits are like their toned down punk look also, just to note.
There's another question from Joanna. She says, hi, everyone. This question is for all the panelists. Have y'all noticed any patterns about how exclusions and unbelongings emerged, even if these spaces were created by marginalized subcultures?
Yesterday, we were talking about that as we were preparing for this. And I invite everyone to at least think about it or chime in. What was the first place that you went that was influential to you in terms of all spaces? Because yesterday we were sharing our first places and how at first it was like a sense of discovery and this is a great community or this is a great space. And then we saw some of those exclusions happening. Some of, as Joanna, you said, those of belongings were either because of politics or particular youth scene or gender identities, people started feeling like, at first it was great, but then the honeymoon kind of ends, and then you start thinking, okay, this is not a space that is safe for me or not welcoming, and then new spaces were created. So that's so maybe you might all think of what was the first space and perhaps how that space was not welcome later, but then you created or you gravitated to other spaces. And I think Susana and Audrey have something to chime in because of our conversation yesterday.
Hello?
Susie, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so I kind of felt that too at the smell, I think, or like spaces like that, you know, also like other spaces that I kind of like saw like disappear, like Pear Space, El Corral, like the Cobalt Cafe, like accessible in the valley. But yeah, like I did feel kind of like still like I came about when it was already getting recognized and like holding on to the dovetails, like wanting to be a part of this. But always kind of feeling like, you know, I'm still kind of an outsider, you know, and even though I'm volunteering here. And I think like when the Riot Girl Carnival, like I just, you know, walked up to Jim Smith, like owner of the Smell, and he was just kind of down for it. He's just like, yeah, very welcoming and just very willing to just kind of like help people create space in at the Smell. Um, and it was a way, I guess, for me to kind of like, you know, feel like there's other brown girls here, like there's other people of color here that I can invite, like, you know, like folks that I might have more relationality with. I still kind of felt like, you know, like an imposter. So, but yeah, so that was one way, like in terms of like creating a space for myself and others like me in a way. And then even then still feeling like, it's kind of like on its own. But I don't know if that answers the question. So.
I'll just quickly add, I think for me, there was definitely a feeling, obviously, like, you know, like I mentioned, everybody who I've interviewed so far has unfortunately shared like an experience of like being groped at a punk show or, you know, having these like, you know, negative experiences. But also, you know, at the same time, like, you know, when you do, there was somewhat like, I don't know, I guess like women-centered spaces or like punks, female-centered spaces or, you know, whatever, like it was still also kind of very white, you know, and you know, I visibly stand out, like, you know, my skin complexion is a little darker. So it's like, I, you know, also don't blend in, you know, with like, you know, white punk spaces. So, I mean, yeah, I think that's why I think something, you know, like Chicas or like these other spaces that are created are, you know, really like important because, you know, for instance, somebody like Alice Bag, you know, she's like an older, you know, woman who like is, you know, keeps her punk, you know, identity and aesthetic and, you know, has done so much, but she's also like, you know, a little bit of a darker tone. And like, for me, like, that's really exciting because we don't really get to see women, you know, much less like darker skinned women of color, you know, like really represent themselves in that way. So I hope that answers the question.
I just want to jump in. We have about 3 minutes left. Is there any, let's see, Michelle Cho says, thanks for the panel. Has a follow-up question. What's the distinction between a scene and a community? How does one inform one another, vice versa? How does musical or fashion aesthetic translate into political sensibility? I guess I'm thinking about DIY culture at the same time. By the way, I used to go to the Smell a lot between 2001 and 2004. It was mostly a scene in my experience. And I'll let you address that. I just want to also talk about those the scenes in the 80s in LA County, southeast of downtown. When I was growing up, like in Bellflower or Lakewood or those Santa Fe Springs. So there was also, I mean, there's a long history. I mean, I don't think there's been an interruption in it. I just wanted to mention that. But also, if you could just address Cho's question, and then we'll have to sign off on that question. So I'll leave it to you.
I'll just chime in real quickly about the difference between a scene and community. And I would say, thank you to Audrey and Susana that have really made me, you know, push to think, you know, about the youth category of this, or because in my work, I am now interviewing folks that were part of these 90s scenes, and they continue to be compadres, comadres together, but they continue to be kind of family because a lot of them were immigrants. And so, yes, they were in a scene, but now it's a community. And some of them are just more about, you know, thinking of their, you know, kind of family bonding, but others are still active as community in politics.
And in terms of like maybe like spaces like the Riot Girl Carnival, I would definitely like, I see like how like the smell can be perceived as like experienced also just like a scene, you know, like something that folks do like on the weekends or, you know, but I feel like events like the Red Girl Carnival, other events like Transgress Fest too, like organized by Drew Ariola from Trap Girl, like they kind of help build community within these so-called scenes, right? And I think that's what is more like in terms of community engagement in these spaces, where community building is possible and it doesn't just have to be a scene, you know?
Audrey, last word.
Sure. Yeah, I think I guess just to piggyback on what Susana said, I think there's that sense of built community, you know, with Drew organizing like Transgress Fest, like it's like there's like, you know, like we all support each other and we all kind of like show up for each other. So it's like, it could be taken like it's a scene, but it's like, you know, Drew does stuff for Chicas Roqueras, and you know, so there's a lot of like mutual support, and I think that's like where the community is built, is like showing up for each other.
Well, that's a wonderful way to end it. We're exactly at 11:15, so showing up for each other. I'm so glad that we got to show up for each other this way. Again, thanks to all the organizers and to all the pop conference fans and Mopop for hosting and helping, and Robert with the tech. So see you all at the next panel, and yeah, have a great rest of the conference. Take care.